Chapter 1 of Mists and Murmurs. The road into the village of La Charnay thinned to a ribbon of churned mud long before the first hovels came into view, as though the land itself sought to turn travellers aside. Hoofprints and cart ruts sank deep and waterlogged, filling with black rainwater that reflected no sky. The air was heavy with mist, a clammy shroud that clung to cloak and skin alike, reeking faintly of rot, damp bark, and something older, an odour like bruised flowers left too long upon a grave. La Charnay crouched at the forest's edge like a penitent awaiting judgment. Its buildings were low and mean, their thatched roofs sagging beneath years of neglect and damp. Timber frames leaned inward, as if sharing secrets, their beams blackened by smoke and mould. No banners flew, no bright colours marked festival or pride. Even the shrine to the lady, set upon a stone plinth near the village well, was crusted with lichen and streaked by rust where rain had run from the iron votive chains. The lady's face, once serene, had weathered into something ambiguous, her eyes shallow pits, her smile a thin, knowing cut. Beyond the last crooked fence post loomed the forest. It did not begin politely, with scattered trees and open glades, but rose all at once, a wall of gnarled trunks and interwoven branches. Oaks and yews twisted together in unnatural intimacy, their bark puckered and scarred like old flesh. Briars snarled at the forest's fringe, hooked thorns clutching at the air. The mist thickened there, pooling low to the ground, seeping from between roots, like breath exhaled by a sleeping beast. From within came sounds that never quite resolved themselves, creaks that might have been boughs swaying or knuckles cracking, sighs that might have been wind or something exhaling through unseen lips. The villagers did not look at the forest if they could help it. They went about their business with eyes downcast, shoulders hunched, fingers never far from charms of wood, bone, or rusted iron. Conversation, when it occurred at all, was low and clipped, as though the fog itself were listening. Doors were barred before dusk. Children were dragged indoors by the ear at the first lengthening of shadows, their protests cut short by sharp slaps and harsher whispers. Dogs, once common, were few now, and those that remained slunk close to walls, whining at nothing, their eyes following movements no one else could see. It was from such whispers that the rumours spread. Old Margot, who kept goats on the far edge of the village, was the first to be spoken of openly. She had gone out before dawn to milk them and returned screaming, her hands red and slick. When they followed her back, 3 men clutching pitchforks and a boy with a club, they found the goats in the clearing beyond her shed. They stood upright, hooves pressed into the mud like misshapen feet, necks bent at obscene angles, their jaws slack and grinning. Rigour had locked their limbs, yet they leaned together in a mockery of a country dance, 4 legs entwined, one corpse propped against another. Their eyes had been pecked out, sockets packed with forest loam and white flowers that did not bloom in that season. When the men tried to pull them down, the bodies cracked and split, spilling entrails that steamed faintly in the cold air. Someone retched, someone prayed, someone laughed briefly, hysterically, before being struck silent. They burned the carcasses where they stood. The smoke rose thick and sweet, and for a moment, only a moment, the men swore they heard music, thin and reedy, threading through the crackle of flames. After that came the cattle. A prized ox was found 2 nights later, dragged half a league from its pen, its bulk improbably wedged between 3 trees whose trunks had grown together like clasped fingers. Its legs had been snapped and repositioned, bent backward and upward, so that the beast appeared to kneel in supplication. Symbols had been carved into its hide spirals, crescents, crude crowns of thorns cut deep enough that the blood had pooled and dried black. Its tongue had been pulled free and nailed to its brow with a thorn as long as a dagger. The reeve ordered silence. He said it was wolves, or bandits, or the work of drunken youths from the next valley. He fined those who spoke otherwise. He doubled the night watch and ordered torches lit along the forest road. The torches went out every night, regardless, not extinguished, but twisted wicks unraveled, pitch scraped away, iron brackets bent as though chewed. One watchman was found at dawn sitting upright against the palisade, eyes wide, mouth stretched in a rictus grin so severe it had split his lips. His torch lay unlit at his feet. There were no wounds upon him, no marks save for muddy footprints circling his body in a careful ring, toes pointed inward. It was the laughter that finally broke them. It came on the third night after the ox, drifting through the fog once the moon had climbed high and thin. At first it was distant, a suggestion rather than a sound, like the echo of mirth carried from a dream. Some thought it the wind moving through hollow trunks, others named foxes or owls. But it grew clearer, closer, threading through the alleys between huts, slipping beneath doors and shutters. It was laughter without warmth, high and lilting one moment, low and breathy the next. It skipped and tangled, overlapping itself in impossible ways. It rose from behind listeners, then whispered from directly ahead. It mocked cadence and rhythm, stopping abruptly only to resume with renewed vigor. No voice could be pinned to it, no throat could be imagined shaping such sounds. It was joy stripped of humanity, mirth divorced from kindness. Men wept into their straw mattresses. Women pressed fingers into their ears until blood ran. Children woke screaming, claiming someone had been calling their names in sing-song voices, promising games in the trees, crowns of leaves, dances that never ended. At dawn, they found young Luc Breton hanging from the old apple tree near the well. He had been a simple lad, slow of speech and strong of arm, employed where muscle mattered more than wit. His feet brushed the ground, knees bent, as though he might have stepped down at any moment. His face was peaceful, almost content, save for the bruising at his throat. Around his neck hung a wreath of wildflowers, fresh and dewy, their stems woven tightly enough to cut skin. Someone had placed a wooden flute in his hands, fingers arranged as if mid-song. No one admitted to seeing him leave his home. His mother beat her fists bloody against the well stones until she collapsed. The reeve said nothing at all. The priest of the lady came at last to the forest's edge, bearing incense and a relic sealed in lead. He was an old man, stooped and coughing, his vestments threadbare but clean. He spoke prayers with a quavering voice, sprinkling blessed water onto roots that drank it greedily. The mist did not recede, the forest did not answer. When he turned to leave, something moved just beyond the tree line, not a shape, not fully a disturbance, a ripple through leaves and fog, for a heartbeat. Those watching thought they saw a figure standing among the trunks, tall, slender, crowned with pale light. Then the moment passed. The priest faltered, clutched at his chest, and later that night he died in his sleep, eyes open, lips curved faintly upward. After that, the road saw travelers again. Word of trouble carried swiftly in Bretonnia, borne by rumor and fear alike. Some came seeking coin, others glory, others absolution. They found La Charnay silent and watchful, its people gaunt with sleeplessness, its air heavy with dread. Each night the laughter returned, and each morning the forest seemed a little closer, its roots breaking through fences, its shadows lengthening across the fields, and always, from the depths of the ancient wood, came the murmurs, soft, coaxing, patient, as though something waited, amused, for the courage of men to finally fail. Chapter 2. The Vow of the Errant Knights. They came at dawn, when the mist still clung low to the ground, and the bells of La Charnay tolled not for prayer, but from habit alone. 5 knights rode down the mire-choked road, their horses labouring, hooves sucking at the earth with wet, obscene sounds. They were not the shining exemplars sung of by troubadours in candle-lit halls, nor the champions whose names were stitched into banners and remembered by generations. These were lesser men, bound together by circumstance and coin as much as by oath, their armour mismatched, their heraldry faded or defaced by time and neglect. Yet they were knights still, and in Bretonnia that meant something. Sir Aldric de Montfaucon rode at their head. His helm bore a dent above the brow, where a mace had once kissed it hard enough to leave him senseless in a roadside skirmish years ago. He wore no plume, only a length of faded blue ribbon tied about his lance, once bright with Lady Blessed dye, now dulled to the colour of old bruises. His jaw was clenched, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights, and beneath his surcoat lay scars that never quite stopped aching. He had sworn many vows in his life, broken more than he would ever confess. To his right rode Sir Etienne Vaux, younger and broader, his armour better kept, though scraped and pitted as though it had known far more use than ceremony. He smelled faintly of wine even in the cold morning air. Etienne laughed too loudly, too often, and crossed himself with exaggerated fervour whenever the forest loomed in his vision. He had once killed a man in a tavern brawl over a woman whose name he could no longer remember. The memory visited him in dreams, always with blood on the floor and laughter in his ears. Behind them came Sir Hugues and Sir Marek, sworn brothers in all but blood. Hugues was thin, ascetic, his armour stripped of decoration, his shield plain save for a crudely painted chalice. He prayed constantly, lips moving even as his gaze flicked nervously from tree line to tree line. Marek, by contrast, was heavy-set and taciturn, his shield bearing the faded sigil of a household long fallen into debt and obscurity. He spoke rarely, but when he did, it was with the flat certainty of a man who had seen too much to believe in easy answers. The last rode slightly apart, Sir Caldus of no fixed holding, a knight-errant in the truest and most damning sense. His armour was blackened, not by polish, but by neglect, the metal dulled and blotched. His cloak was torn, its once proud colours unrecognizable. Where others wore relics or tokens of the lady, Caldus bore nothing save a simple iron ring on his finger. His eyes were pale and distant, his expression unreadable. Rumour said he had once turned his lance against another knight in a moment of unholy rage. Rumour said many things. They reined in before the village square, horses snorting and stamping, sensing the unease that hung over the place like a pall. No children ran to greet them, no bells rang in welcome. Doors remained shut, shutters twitched, then stilled. Sir Aldric dismounted first, his boots sinking into the mud. He removed his helm and looked about him, taking in the sagging buildings, the hollow-eyed villagers who watched from behind door-frames and carts. His mouth tightened. "This place stinks of fear," Etienne muttered, sliding from his saddle and flexing his fingers. "And rot." "Aye," Marek said quietly. "Fear rots faster than flesh." At length the reeve came forth, wringing his hands, bowing so low his forehead nearly brushed the ground. He stammered out thanks and pleas in equal measure, words tumbling over one another. Aldrich listened in silence, nodding once when the man finished. "You will tell us everything," Aldrich said. "Not rumors, not half-truths, everything." They were led to the shrine near the well, where the stone lady watched with her eroded gaze. There, amid the smell of damp stone and old incense, the villagers spoke. They told of dancing corpses, of laughter without source, of flowers blooming in bloodied flesh. They spoke of the forest not as wood and leaf, but as something willful, hungry. Hughes clutched his prayer beads so tightly his knuckles whitened. Etienne scoffed once, then fell silent when no one laughed with him. Caldus said nothing at all. When the tales were done, Aldrich turned to his companions. "We ride before nightfall," he said. "We will make camp at the forest's edge. Whatever foulness dwells there, we will confront it." Hughes swallowed. "With respect, my lord, perhaps we should send word to—" "No," Aldrich snapped, more sharply than intended. He closed his eyes briefly, mastering himself. "This is our charge, our penance, if you will. The lady tests us as she tests all her servants." At that, all 5 knelt. They knelt in the mud before the shrine, armor creaking, water seeping into joints and mail. Aldrich drew his sword and planted its tip in the earth, bowing his head. One by one, the others followed suit, blades forming a rough circle. "I swear," Aldrich intoned, voice low but firm, "to uphold my vows, to protect the innocent, and to bring righteous judgment upon the wicked." "I swear," Etienne echoed, his voice wavering for just a heartbeat. "I swear," Hughes whispered, tears tracking down his cheeks. "I swear," Marek said, steady as stone. There was a pause. Caldus hesitated, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. When he spoke, it was barely audible. "I swear to see this done." The wind stirred then. Though the air had been still, the mist shifted. For a fleeting moment, Aldrich thought he heard something like distant laughter, quickly swallowed by the morning quiet. They rode for the forest. As they approached, the land itself seemed to resist them. Paths narrowed, then vanished. Roots rose like grasping hands. Their horses grew skittish, rolling their eyes, snorting, refusing commands they had obeyed 100 times before. Etienne cursed and struck his mount. The beast screamed and nearly threw him. "Enough," Aldrich barked. "Easy, easy." They dismounted at the tree line, tying their horses to a stout oak whose bark was carved with old, half-erased symbols, wards, perhaps, or warnings. Hughes muttered a prayer as he traced one with trembling fingers. The forest swallowed them whole within a dozen paces. Light dimmed beneath the canopy, turning sickly green and brown. The air grew colder, heavier, thick with the scent of loam and decay. Sounds distorted. A snapped twig echoed like a gunshot, while footsteps vanished entirely. Their armor scraped and whispered with every movement, a constant reminder of their own presence in a place that did not want them. They advanced in a loose line, blades drawn. Sweat ran beneath their mail, despite the chill. Aldrich's thoughts churned of past failures, of vows unkept, of blood on his hands that prayer had never quite washed away. A scream shattered the quiet. It came from ahead, high and shrill, cutting off abruptly. Without thinking, Etienne charged, shouting a prayer and a curse in the same breath. Aldrich followed, the others close behind, crashing through undergrowth, thorns tearing at cloth and flesh. They burst into a clearing and found nothing. No victim, no attacker, only a circle of pale mushrooms, their caps faintly luminescent, arranged with deliberate care. At the center lay a severed deer's head, eyes wide, tongue lolling. Its antlers were wrapped in garlands of wildflowers, fresh and damp. Marek swore. Hughes gagged. Caldus knelt, examining the ground. "No tracks," he said. "Or too many. They overlap. Wrong." The laughter came then, close enough to raise goose-flesh, darting from tree to tree. Etienne spun, swinging wildly. His blade met nothing but air, and then something struck him from behind. He went down hard, armor ringing. Aldrich shouted, raising his shield just in time to catch a blur of movement, something slender and fast, all pale limbs and flashing eyes. The impact nearly knocked him from his feet. He struck back, his sword biting into bark, and the tree bled. Dark ichor oozed from the wound, steaming. The forest seemed to sigh. From all sides came motion now, shapes flitting at the edge of sight. Laughter rising and falling, a cacophony of mirth and menace. Hughes screamed as something slashed his cheek, leaving a burn like frostbite. Marek bellowed and charged, his axe cleaving through a shape that burst into a cloud of petals and gore. This was no battlefield, they understood. No foe that met them honorably. Aldrich realized then, with a cold certainty that settled in his gut, that their vows, their faith, their steel, all of it meant far less here than they had ever imagined, and the forest knew it. Chapter 3. The Peasantry's Midnight Revel. The forest did not release its grip upon the village with the coming of night. Rather, it drew closer, as if emboldened by darkness. When the sun slipped behind the jagged line of trees, the mists thickened until La Charnay seemed afloat upon a pale, shifting sea. Smoke from hearth fires lay low and sour, clinging to roofs and throats alike. Doors were barred, shutters sealed, yet still the night crept in through knotholes and cracks, whispering promises it never intended to keep. The peasants did not gather openly anymore. No fires were lit in the square, no songs were sung. Instead, small knots of men and women huddled in barns and sheds, among stacked cordwood and sacks of charcoal dust, speaking in voices scarcely louder than breath. Their faces were drawn and grey, eyes ringed black with sleeplessness. Hands trembled as they passed skins of weak ale, more for the comfort of holding something than for the drink itself. It was the woodcutters who spoke first, for they were the ones forced closest to the forest's heart. They told of lights between the trunks, wandering globes of pale green and gold, bobbing gently as though borne by unseen hands. At first, the men had taken them for marsh fires or the lanterns of other cutters strayed too late from camp. But the lights did not behave as flames should. They pulsed like living things, swelling and shrinking in time with unheard rhythms. They drifted against the wind, slipped between branches without dimming, and sometimes arranged themselves into careful rings, hovering just above the forest floor. One man swore he had followed them for hours, though the moon had barely moved. Another claimed the lights whispered to him, calling him by name in the voice of his dead wife. When he turned to flee, the trees had shifted, paths folding in on themselves, until he found himself standing before his own campfire, cold, dead, and surrounded by footprints that were not his own. The charcoal burners had worse tales still. They worked deeper within the wood, tending their smouldering pits for days at a time. They spoke of sleep that offered no refuge, of dreams that continued after waking, bleeding into the world until they could no longer tell thought from sight. In those dreams, the forest opened into vast clearings filled with revelry, long tables laden with rotting fruit and steaming meat, dancers spinning barefoot upon carpets of moss, music that throbbed like a living pulse beneath the skin. They dreamed of laughter that wrapped around the mind and squeezed. One burner, a gaunt man named Perrot, claimed he had woken to find his hands raw and bleeding, his fingernails torn away. He remembered dancing all night, clapping and stamping to the music, his palms striking bark and stone until pain became pleasure and pleasure became something else entirely. When dawn came, he found symbols carved into his chest, spirals and crowns of thorns, the cuts neat and deliberate, as though made by a careful lover. None of them spoke of resisting the dreams. They spoke instead of how sweet they were. It was this sweetness that frightened them most, for amid the terror and the blood, there was a sense of belonging. In the dreams, they were not peasants bowed beneath toil and tithe. They were guests, chosen, seen. They were offered wine that burned like honeyed fire, bread that tasted of summer fields long gone, hands that pulled them into the dance and would not let go. They awoke, exhausted and hollow, longing for sleep even as they dreaded it. The disappearance happened 3 nights after the knights rode into the forest. His name was Lucien Fevre, a charcoal burner with a limp from an old crush injury and a habit of talking too much when afraid. He had always been quick, with a nervous smile, eager to please, desperate to be liked. On that night, he staggered into the barn where the others hid, eyes bright and unfocused. Charcoal dust streaked across his face like war paint. "I danced," he said, laughing softly. "By the lady I danced." They tried to hush him, glancing at the doors, at the cracks where moonlight leaked through. But Lucien only laughed again, louder this time, swaying on his feet. "She crowned me," he went on. "A queen, O saints, preserve us. She was beautiful. Thorns in her hair, silver skin, eyes like starlight through water. She called me sweet coal heart, said I burned so well. Someone struck him then, a sharp blow across the mouth. Blood spattered the hay. Lucien fell silent, staring in shock, and then he smiled. "She said I could stay," he whispered. "Said the forest loves those who give themselves freely." They bound him that night, out of fear more than cruelty. Rope bit into his wrists and ankles as he struggled weakly, murmuring endearments to no one they could see. He sang, to an odd, lilting tune none of them recognized, its melody crawling beneath the skin. When at last exhaustion claimed him, they left him tied and watched until dawn. Lucien was gone by morning. The rope lay neatly coiled upon the barn floor, unknotted. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, only a trail of muddy footprints leading toward the forest, barefoot and light, as though the ground itself had carried him away. Where the tracks ended, at the tree line, grew a ring of white flowers, their petals sharp-edged, as if cut from bone. That night, the revel came to La Charnay itself. It began subtly, a hum beneath the wind, a tremor through the earth that set cups rattling on shelves. Then came the lights, drifting down from the forest like curious stars, floating between houses, brushing walls and doors. They cast no heat, yet where they passed, frost bloomed across wood and stone in delicate patterns. Music followed pipes and drums and strings, though no musicians could be seen. The sound was everywhere and nowhere, swelling and receding, pulling at the heart with invisible hooks. Feet began to move without permission. Fingers twitched. Breath quickened. One by one, peasants emerged from their homes. Some came willingly, eyes glazed, smiles slack. Others fought, clawing at doorframes, screaming as unseen hands dragged them into the square. Clothing was torn away. Hair came loose. Faces contorted between ecstasy and terror. The lights circled them, herding them together, while the music grew faster, more insistent. They danced. They danced until skin split and feet bled, until joints popped and muscles tore. They danced with each other, with shadows, with shapes half seen at the edge of the lights, slender forms with too many joints, grinning mouths full of needle teeth. Laughter rang out, layered and merciless. At the center of the square, something rose. It was a throne of living wood, roots and branches twisting upward in a grotesque parody of nobility. Upon it sat the Queen of Thorns. She was tall and impossibly slender, her limbs long as willow branches. Her skin gleamed pale as moonlit bark, traced with veins of green that pulsed softly. Thorns crowned her brow and ran down her spine, piercing flesh without drawing blood. Her eyes were dark hollows filled with starlight, and when she smiled, flowers bloomed and withered at her feet. She watched the dance with indulgent amusement. When a peasant faltered, she gestured languidly, and unseen forces tore them apart, limbs wrenched from sockets, bodies flung screaming into walls and wells. The music never stopped. The dancers never slowed. Blood slicked the stones, steaming in the cold night air, and still they danced, slipping and laughing and weeping. Lucien appeared at her side, or what remained of him. His body was stretched and reshaped, limbs elongated, joints bent backward. Thorns burst from his skin, flowering grotesquely along his arms and legs. His face was frozen in rapture, mouth open in a silent laugh. He bowed deeply to the Queen, and she reached out to stroke his cheek with fingers that ended in bark and briar. "See how they love us," she said, her voice a chorus of whispers. "See how they remember what they are." As dawn crept closer, the revel broke apart as suddenly as it had begun. Music cut off mid-note. Lights winked out. Those still alive collapsed where they stood, twitching and sobbing, bodies broken beyond repair. When the sun rose, La Charnay was a slaughterhouse. Dozens lay dead, their corpses arranged in mocking poses, hands clasped, mouths stretched in laughter, wreaths of thorn and flower pressed into their flesh. Others lived, but would never truly wake again, their eyes empty, their lips murmuring fragments of song. The forest withdrew, satisfied, and in the silence that followed, the survivors understood a terrible truth. The revel was not an invasion. It was an invitation. Chapter 4. The enchantress revealed. No one saw her plainly. Those who claimed they had were either dead, mad, or both, and even they disagreed on what they had witnessed. The truth of the enchantress did not permit a single shape, nor did it endure direct scrutiny. She was a thing perceived only by reflection, by implication, by the after-image burned into the mind when one stared too long into terror and desire intertwined. It began with mirrors. La Charnay had few to begin with, polished bits of tin, darkened glass kept for shaving or superstition, but after the revel, those few became objects of dread. Peasants noticed their reflections lagging behind their movements, smiles lingering a fraction of a second too long. Some swore their mirrored selves blinked when they did not. Others claimed to see a tall figure standing behind them, pale and crowned, visible only in the reflection, and gone when they turned. Old Isabeau shattered her looking-glass after screaming that it smiled at her through her own face. She was found hours later with her throat torn open, her blood pooled in a shape like a blossoming flower. No footprints marked the floor. Then there were the pools. Rainwater collected everywhere, after the revel gutters, cart ruts, hollows in stone. In those dark surfaces, villagers glimpsed things that did not belong to the waking world. A woman bending close to the water would see not her own lined face, but a younger version of herself, naked and adorned in vines, laughing as unseen hands traced her skin. A man gazing down might see a crown of thorns descending toward his brow, hovering just above his reflection, waiting. The water never rippled when these visions appeared. One child, a boy no more than 6, stared into the well for so long that his mother dragged him away shrieking. He had begun to speak in a strange, lilting cadence, repeating a single phrase over and over. She wants to be remembered. The knights learned of the enchantress through fragments. Sir Hughes was the first to speak of her directly, though he never used her name. They found him kneeling beside a stream deep within the forest, his armor removed, his bare hands submerged in the black water despite the cold. His lips moved in fervent prayer, sweat standing out upon his brow. "I saw her," he whispered, when Aldrich pulled him back. "In the water. Only for a moment. She was radiant." Aldrich struck him, hard enough to split his lip. Hughes laughed as blood ran down his chin. "She smiled at me," he said. "Not kindly, not cruelly, as one smiles at a toy." That night, Hughes dreamed. He dreamed of a vast hall grown from living wood, its pillars twisting skyward like frozen dancers. At its center lay a mirror taller than any man, its surface rippling like disturbed water. From within it stepped the enchantress, not walking, but unfolding, as though her form were being remembered into existence. She was beautiful, not in the clean, distant way of stained glass saints or marble idols, but in a manner that made the heart race and the stomach churn. Her proportions were almost human, close enough to deceive at a glance, wrong enough to unsettle upon longer study. Her limbs were too long, her joints bending with fluid grace that suggested no bones constrained her. Her skin gleamed pale as moonlit bark, faintly translucent, veins glowing green and gold beneath it. Thorns crowned her brow, piercing flesh that did not bleed. Flowers bloomed where the thorns broke skin, opening and withering in the span of a breath. Her eyes were vast and dark, filled not with pupils but with a slow, drifting light like stars seen through deep water. She regarded Hughes as one might regard an insect that had begun, inexplicably, to prey. "You wear his guilt poorly," she said, her voice layered, harmonized with itself, each word spoken by a dozen mouths that did not exist. "It clings to you. It squeaks." Hughes fell prostrate, sobbing, begging the lady for protection. The enchantress laughed. The sound flayed him. It stripped away prayer and certainty alike, peeling back his faith until nothing remained but raw need. She knelt before him, impossibly close, and brushed his cheek with fingers that were bark and flesh and thorn all at once. "Your lady does not walk here," she whispered. "But I do." When Hughes awoke, he was screaming. His eyes were ruined, pupils blown wide, irises clouded as though scalded. He clawed at his face, raving of crowns and mirrors and laughter that bent the world. It took Marek and Etienne together to restrain him. By dawn, Hughes could no longer speak, only moan softly, rocking back and forth, lips bleeding where he had bitten through them. The enchantress was seen again in blood. After the skirmish at the Mushroom Ring, they found a fallen knight, one of Etienne's retainers, separated in the chaos. His body lay against a tree, spine broken, head lolling. His blood had pooled beneath him, dark and glossy. In it, Aldrich saw her, not reflected, exactly suggested, the curve of her throat where the blood ran thin, the line of her jaw in the shadow cast by a root. When the pool trembled, her smile trembled with it. "You look tired, Oathbreaker," she murmured, though no sound passed her lips. Aldrich recoiled, bile rising in his throat. He hacked at the blood with his sword, splattering it across leaves and bark. The image shattered and then reformed in a dozen smaller pools, her laughter echoing softly through the trees. Sir Calder said nothing, but that night, as the others slept fitfully, he sat apart, staring into the dull sheen of his blackened breastplate. His reflection was warped by dents and grime, yet within it he saw movement slow, deliberate. A crown descended toward his brow. He closed his eyes before it touched him. The enchantress did not need to appear fully. Her presence seeped into memory and flesh alike, rewriting perception. Men recalled moments from their past and found her standing there instead, at the edge of childhood forests, behind lovers' eyes, reflected faintly in polished steel during long-forgotten battles. She had always been watching, always waiting. She was ancient, beyond reckoning. The forest knew her as root and rot, as bloom and blight. Long before stone shrines and chivalric vows, before Bretonnian blood had soaked the soil, she had ruled the green places. Empires had risen and fallen like brief amusements. She remembered them all, as one remembers dreams, vivid in sensation, indistinct in detail. What amused her now was not conquest, it was remembrance. She wore beauty as bait, cruelty as correction. Those who approached her seeking mercy found themselves remade, elongated, adorned, woven into her revel as dancers, musicians, courtiers whose suffering delighted her. Those who resisted fared no better, for defiance merely sharpened her interest. "You call me monster," she whispered once, her voice carried on sap and wind. "Yet you built your homes with my bones. You crowned your kings with my leaves. You sang my songs until you forgot their names." Her image flickered in every polished surface, every still pool, every eye clouded by fever or fear. She could not be struck, nor prayed away. She existed in the spaces between thought and reflection, between waking and dream. And always she smiled, not because she was happy, but because she was entertained. As the knights pressed deeper into the forest, bleeding and exhausted, they began to understand a truth far more terrible than any blade or claw. They were not facing a foe to be slain. They were guests, and the enchantress had not yet decided how the evening would end. Chapter 5. Of Love Misplaced and Names Forgotten. Love was the next thing the forest took from them. It did not seize it brutally at first. There were no screams, no sudden eruptions of gore or glamour. Love was loosened, gently, patiently, teased apart like a thread from an old garment, until no one quite remembered when it had begun to unravel. It started with glances. Sir Etienne found his eyes drawn again and again to Sir Marek, not with the camaraderie of arms, nor the wary respect of soldiers who had bled together, but with a heat that made his skin prickle beneath his mail. He noticed the way Marek's shoulders filled his cuirass, the slow strength in his movements, the steadiness of his hands. The thoughts came unbidden and unwelcome, twisting his gut with shame and confusion. He drank to drown them, muttered prayers with wine-soured breath, yet the more he resisted, the more insistent the feeling became. Across the camp, Aldrich watched the villagers they had taken under protection with an intensity that unsettled him. A young woman, her name danced just beyond his grasp, tended the fire, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, hands red and cracked from labor. When she looked up, their eyes met, and something shifted. For an instant, he saw her not as she was, but as something crowned and radiant, her shadow stretching impossibly long behind her. He nearly spoke a vow aloud. Sir Caldus noticed these changes and said nothing. He felt them too, a tug beneath the ribs whenever he looked upon another living soul, as though his heart were being coaxed into unfamiliar rhythms. Faces seemed closer than they should be. Voices lingered in his ears long after words were spoken. Desire crept through him like an infection, impersonal, indiscriminate, gnawing. Among the peasants, the rot spread faster. Betrothed couples woke from sleep snarling at one another, convinced of betrayals that had never occurred. A man accused his wife of bedding the forest spirits. She clawed his eyes out before he could strike her. Lovers who had shared bread and bed for years suddenly found themselves repulsed by one another's touch, while strangers felt an aching, desperate need to be close. Any closeness would do. Names began to slip. A mother called her child and could not remember the sound she had used 1,000 times before. A man introduced himself, then faltered, mouth hanging open as the syllables dissolved on his tongue. Titles followed: reeve, husband, knight, losing meaning, becoming empty shapes. Even faces blurred at the edges, features smearing together in memory like wet ink. The enchantress delighted in this confusion. She walked unseen among them, her presence marked only by sudden shifts in mood and thought. Where she passed, affection bloomed into obsession or curdled into hatred. Bonds forged over lifetimes snapped like rotten twine. She whispered promises into ears already raw with fear and longing. "You were never loved enough," she murmured. "You deserve more. Give yourself to the dance." Sir Hughes, blind and broken, was the first among the knights to succumb completely. They found him one morning standing at the forest's edge, his ruined eyes turned skyward, a serene smile on his bloodless lips. He spoke softly to someone no one else could see, praising her beauty, her mercy, her understanding. Thorns had begun to push through his skin, small at first, like splinters beneath the flesh of his arms and neck. "She knows me," he said when Aldrich tried to pull him away. "She knows my sins and loves me still." The thorns burst through his throat as he spoke, spraying blood across Aldrich's hands. Hughes collapsed without a sound, his body already stiffening, bark creeping across his limbs as though the forest claimed him eagerly. By nightfall, his corpse had rooted itself to the soil, half man, half tree, his face locked in bliss. Etienne wept as they left him behind. That night, the dreams grew worse. Men dreamed of lovers whose faces shifted with every blink. Women dreamed of hands caressing them that ended in claws and thorns. In sleep, the enchantress appeared more boldly, never fully, never directly, but close enough to be felt. She kissed brows and throats, leaving phantom pain and longing in her wake. She spoke names that listeners did not recognize, yet felt were their own. When they woke, some found those names carved into their skin. In La Charnay, violence erupted openly. A wedding meant to salvage hope became a slaughter. The bride, eyes shining with unnatural fervor, declared her love not for her groom but for the forest itself. When he tried to restrain her, she bit out his throat and danced barefoot in his blood, laughing as unseen music filled the square. Others joined her, tearing at one another, coupling amid corpses, weeping and shrieking as pleasure and agony merged. Children wandered off, hand in hand, with figures only they could see. Those who tried to stop them found themselves struck blind by roots bursting from the earth, or strangled by vines that slithered like serpents. The forest took its tithe eagerly, reshaping flesh and memory alike. The knights fared little better. Etienne swore devotion to Aldrich one night, falling to his knees by the fire, pressing his lips to Aldrich's gauntleted hand. His confession spilled out in a rush of desire and despair, words half remembered, half invented. Aldrich pulled away in horror, striking him across the face. shouting prayers to drown out the whispering laughter that rose from the trees. The blow only deepened Etienne's devotion. Marek, seeing the decay in his companions, began carving their names into his shield each night, muttering them like a litany to keep them real. Each morning, some of the letters had changed. Some names were spelled wrong. One night, he woke to find his own name scratched over, replaced by a symbol of thorns and spirals. Sir Coldus alone resisted, not because he was stronger, but because he had already lost too much. His memories were scarred and fragmented, his sense of self worn thin by years of wandering and regret. The enchantress found little purchase there. Still, she tried. She came to him in a dream as a woman he once loved, her face perfect, unblemished by time or betrayal. She offered absolution, a chance to forget the blood on his hands, the oath he had broken, the brother he had slain. "Lay down your name," she whispered. "Names are chains." He woke screaming, iron ring cutting into his finger where he had clenched his fist until blood flowed. By the fourth night, Aldrich could no longer remember the names of the men he had commanded for years. He remembered their voices, their armor, the weight of responsibility, but when he tried to speak to them, only silence came. He feared that if he let go, even for a moment, he would forget himself entirely. He carved his name into the inside of his shield with shaking hands, the letters jagged and crude. Aldrich. The enchantress laughed at that. Love twisted further, becoming a weapon. A peasant woman embraced her husband, sobbing apologies, only to drive a knife into his back as unseen hands guided her arm. A knight kissed a dying villager's forehead and felt such overwhelming tenderness that he could not bring himself to pull away as roots burst from the ground and impaled them both. Affection no longer followed reason nor even instinct. It flowed where the enchantress willed, binding victim to victim, executioner to lover, devotion to annihilation. And beneath it all, memory continued to erode. People forgot why they were afraid, forgot what they had lost, forgot what the world had been like before the forest's laughter seeped into their bones. They remembered only the dance, the warmth of bodies pressed close, the promise of belonging beneath the boughs. By dawn, the camp was smaller. Some had wandered into the trees willingly, smiling, hands entwined with invisible partners. Others lay dead, their faces peaceful, their names gone from the lips of those who mourned them. Aldrich stood alone at the edge of the clearing, staring at his shield. The letters of his name were fading, the grooves filling with sap that oozed and hardened like amber. He pressed his forehead to the cold metal and prayed, not for victory, nor salvation, but simply to remember who he was when the night came again. Deep within the forest, the enchantress watched with quiet delight. Love, she knew, was the most exquisite cruelty of all, and she was only just beginning. Chapter 6. The Mask of Bark and Bone. The masquerade announced itself not with trumpets or drums, but with growth. It began beneath the skin. Those who still slept were woken by itching so fierce it bordered on agony. Fingers clawed at faces and necks as hard nodules pushed up from beneath, flesh knots like seeds sprouting in meat. Skin split soundlessly, not torn but parted, as though it had been waiting for this moment. From the wounds emerged bark, pale at first, then darkening as it hardened, veins of sap pulsing where blood should have flowed. Masks formed themselves. A peasant woman screamed as her jaw elongated, teeth fusing into a blunt, herbivore's grin. Her nose flattened and widened, antler nubs punched through her scalp with a wet crack. She collapsed, thrashing, as hooves burst from her feet and split her boots apart. When she rose again, it was as a thing half doe, half woman, her human eyes still intact, and weeping from within a skull no longer hers. Others fared worse. A woodcutter's face peeled away in strips as something avian forced itself outward, bone reshaping, eye sockets stretching until they could house the unblinking orbs of an owl. His arms twisted backward, joints popping, feathers erupting through torn sleeves. He flapped uselessly, shrieking, until the pain ebbed and the scream softened into a hollow, clicking hoot. The knights were not spared. Sir Etienne woke choking as his helm constricted around his skull, iron fusing to flesh. Beneath it, his face burned as something pressed outward, snout forming, teeth rearranging into sharp, predatory points. He tore the helm free with a howl, flinging it aside in a spray of blood and teeth, revealing a wolf's visage stretched grotesquely over human bone. His eyes remained his own, wide with terror and rapture alike. Marek tried to cut the growth away. He hacked at his forearm as bark crept along it, axe biting deep. The wood screamed not from the wound, but from him. Sap spilled thick and amber, hardening instantly, sealing the cut as though mocking his defiance. Roots burst from his palm, curling into talons. When he dropped the axe, the roots tightened, fusing bone and timber together. Sir Aldrich resisted longest. He prayed as the change took hold, words slurring as his mouth stiffened, his cheeks split, jaw elongating into a horse's skull crowned with splintered teeth. Mane-like growths burst from his scalp, tangling with his hair and helm. He remained upright through it all, hands clenched around his sword, refusing to scream until the very end, when his spine cracked and forced him to his knees. Only Sir Caldus remained untouched. He stood amid the transformation, breathing hard, watching men and women he had known for days or years become living costumes, their suffering rendered ornamental. The enchantress had spared him again, not out of mercy, but anticipation. He felt her attention settle upon him like a hand upon the back of his neck. When the music began, it was already too late. The forest opened, trees bent and parted, trunks unknitting themselves to form a vast hall beneath the canopy. Roots rose from the earth like coiled serpents, shaping arches and balconies. Lanterns of glowing fungus and bottled will-o'-wisps ignited one by one, casting lurid light across the assembled revelers. They gathered, those who could still walk. Peasants and knights alike staggered forward, bodies reshaped into caricatures of beasts, stags and boars, foxes and owls, wolves and things without earthly name. Masks of bark and bone were no longer adornments. They were the face. Where straps might have been, sinew held them fast. Where eye-holes might have been, new eyes gazed out, bright with unnatural awareness. Some laughed, some sobbed, most danced. The music throbbed from the forest itself, drums beaten by roots striking stone, pipes groaned from hollowed branches, strings plucked by unseen claws. It burrowed into muscle and marrow, seizing limbs and bending them to its rhythm. Bodies moved whether their owners wished it or not, joints grinding, hooves and claws pounding the earth slick with blood and sap. At the center of the hall rose a dais of interwoven thorns and white bone. Upon it sat the enchantress. She was more visible now, though still never whole. Her lower body merged with the dais, roots entwining her hips and thighs. Her upper form shifted constantly, sometimes woman, sometimes something closer to deer or bird or flower, her beauty rearranging itself with lazy whimsy. Her crown of thorns had grown larger, flowering with blossoms that opened and closed in time with the music. She clapped slowly, delighted. "Ah," she purred, her voice amplified by the hall, echoing within skulls rather than ears. "How well you wear my gifts." She gestured, and servants approached once human things dragging trays grown from bark, laden with goblets carved from skulls and filled with thick, shimmering liquid. Revelers drank without thought, the substance burning sweet and cold as it slid down their throats. Where it spilled, skin bubbled and reshaped further, details sharpening, animal traits asserting dominance. Sir Etienne danced. His movements were wild and powerful, lupine grace overtaking clumsy humanity. He howled with joy, leaping and spinning, teeth flashing red. He did not notice when he tore a peasant's throat out mid-step, did not slow as the body fell limp. Blood sprayed his muzzle. He licked it eagerly, eyes rolling back in ecstasy. Marek fought the dance until his legs betrayed him. Roots forced his feet to move, stamping and turning. His bull-like mask snorted steam, horns gouging those who strayed too close. Each impact sent jolts of pleasure and pain through him until he could no longer tell which he felt. He bellowed, the sound echoing and joining the music. Aldrich was dragged to the dais. Two revelers, one bare-headed, the other insectile and chitin-plated, hauled him forward by the arms. He struggled, hooves skidding, sword lost somewhere behind him. The enchantress leaned down, her face resolving into something almost kind. "You were so devoted to your vows," she said softly. "Tell me, do you still know them?" Aldrich opened his mouth to speak and realized he could not remember the words. She smiled. With a flick of her wrist, thorns lashed out, piercing his chest and pinning him in place. They did not kill him. They held him, presenting him to the crowd like a prized carving. His blood ran freely, feeding the roots beneath the dais. "Dance for him," the enchantress commanded. And they did. They danced around Aldrich as he bled, hooves and claws stamping inches from his face. Some pressed close, rubbing their masks against his, whispering nonsense syllables and half-remembered names. One kissed him, bark lips cracking against his cheek, leaving splinters embedded in his skin. Caldus watched from the edge. The enchantress's gaze found him at last. "You will not wear a mask?" she asked, amusement tinged with irritation. "Do you think yourself above my revel?" Caldus stepped forward, drawing his sword. "I know what you are," he said hoarsely. "And I know what you do." She laughed, a sound like branches snapping underfoot. "You know nothing, but you feel, and that is enough." She rose from the dais, roots tearing free with wet sounds, and descended toward him. Up close, her beauty was unbearable, features shifting too quickly for the mind to grasp, every form a temptation, every glance a promise of annihilation. She reached out, fingers hovering inches from his face. "Let me show you how well you would wear me." For a moment, only a moment, Caldus wavered. Then he drove his sword into his own thigh. Pain exploded through him, white-hot and grounding. Blood spilled onto the roots at his feet, steaming. The enchantress recoiled, more startled than hurt. "How rude," she hissed. The music faltered. The dance stuttered. In that heartbeat of disruption, some revelers screamed, true screams, voices cracking through animal throats. As awareness surged back, a few tore at their masks, fingers snapping as they clawed at fused bone and bark. The enchantress snarled and clapped her hands sharply. The music resumed, louder than before. Those who had hesitated were seized by roots and dragged screaming beneath the floor of the hall. Their cries cut short as the earth swallowed them. The revel redoubled, violence escalating, dancers tearing one another apart in frenzied abandon. Caldus was hurled back by unseen force, crashing into a tree hard enough to crack ribs. As darkness crept in at the edges of his vision, He saw the enchantress reclaim her throne, smiling serenely. The masquerade would continue until dawn. By morning, there would be fewer masks and fewer faces beneath them. Chapter 7. The Victorian Eye of Reason. The journal was bound in calfskin and optimism. It had been issued to Father Scholar Emeric Valancourt by the Collegium of Sacred Letters in Couronne, its pages thick and creamy, its margins wide enough for annotations and cross-references. The first leaf bore his name in a precise copper-plate hand, followed by a motto in High Breton, Ratio est lux contra tenebras, reason is the light against darkness. Emeric believed this with the fervor of a convert. He had joined the errant knights, not out of martial devotion, but out of scholarly duty. Reports of mass hysteria, pagan survivals, and alleged fey manifestations had reached the Collegium, and Emeric, trained in theology, natural philosophy, and the emerging discipline of ethnographic cataloguing, had volunteered to observe, record, and explain. The forest, he believed, was not evil. It was misunderstood. Fear, ignorance, and superstition had dressed it in monstrous raiment. He would undress it with ink. Day 1. Upon entering the afflicted region, the village of La Charnay exhibits classic symptoms of collective delusion exacerbated by famine stressors and recent violence. Reports of dancing livestock and voices in the mist are almost certainly metaphorical exaggerations. The human mind, when deprived of rest and order, invents patterns where none exist. Emeric wrote this while seated on a three-legged stool in a half-collapsed barn, quills scratching steadily as screams echoed faintly from the forest's edge. He noted them as auditory disturbances, possibly caused by night birds or wind shear through dense foliage. When a peasant woman ran past the barn, naked and bleeding, antlers splitting her scalp, Emeric paused only long enough to underline mass psychogenic illness twice. Day 2. I have observed remarkable dermatological phenomena among the peasantry. Growths resembling keratinous protrusions, horn-like, in some cases appeared to coincide with periods of extreme emotional excitation. I posit a rare fungal spore, or pollen, acting as a hallucinogen and mutagen in equal measure. He did not mention that one of the protrusions had opened an eye and blinked at him, nor did he mention the way his hand shook when he tried to eat, or how the taste of bread reminded him of loam and sap. Emeric prided himself on detachment. While knights screamed and peasants tore one another apart in fits of ecstatic violence, he observed. He measured distances, sketched symbols, collected samples, hair tangled with bark, blood that smelled faintly of flowers, fragments of bone engraved with spirals. He catalogued dreams. He spoke to survivors, recording their testimony in neat columns. Subject, claim, likely interpretation. When a man insisted he had danced with a queen made of thorns, Emeric nodded sympathetically and wrote, personification of environmental hostility combined with repressed libidinal urges. The man tore out Emeric's left eye with his thumb before anyone could stop him. Emeric screamed for exactly 9 seconds. He noted this later with professional interest. Day 4. Ocular trauma sustained. Vision impaired, but cognitive faculties remain intact. Pain is manageable. It is imperative I continue my work. To cease now would be to concede victory to ignorance. The handwriting wavered. Blood had soaked the edge of the page, flaking brown as it dried. Emeric had wrapped his ruined eye socket in linen and herbs, muttering prayers even as he wrote. He told himself the pain sharpened his clarity. He told himself many things. That night he dreamed of mirrors. In the dream, he stood in a vast gallery, lined with reflective surfaces, polished steel, still water, black glass. In each, he saw himself, one-eyed, stooped, ink-stained. But behind each reflection stood a figure he could not quite focus on, crowned and smiling. He woke laughing. The sound horrified him. Day 5. Increasing evidence suggests a single organizing intelligence behind the phenomena. This does not necessitate supernatural explanation. A charismatic cult leader, likely female, given recurring maternal and erotic motifs, could easily orchestrate rituals designed to exploit local folklore. He posed, kill hovering. However, there is a consistency of symbolism across disparate accounts that troubles me. The symbols had begun to appear in his own writing. He did not remember drawing the thorned spirals in the margins. He did not remember scratching names into the desk beside his bed, names that were not his own, nor anyone he could recall meeting. He found one morning that he had written an entire page in a language he did not know how to read, yet understood perfectly. It described him. The knights avoided him now. Sir Curdles watched Emeric with narrowed eyes, hand never far from his sword. Sir Aldrich, what remained of him, barely spoke at all, his voice distorted by the shape his jaw had taken. Emeric noted this with clinical interest, though he could no longer remember Aldrich's face as it had once been. Faces were becoming difficult. They slid away in memory, like images seen through running water. Names followed. Emeric wrote lists to keep hold of them, but the lists changed overnight, letters rearranging themselves into new configurations that made his head ache when he tried to read them. He began numbering the days twice. Day 7? I must acknowledge the possibility that my earlier hypotheses were insufficient. The scale of transformation exceeds known natural mechanisms. If there is a mind at work here, it is vast, distributed, not centralized, but pervasive, like a field or an ecosystem. The page tore where his quill pressed too hard. This does not mean it is divine. The words were underlined so deeply the paper nearly split. A scream cut through the camp, then long, wet, abruptly silenced. Emeric did not look up. He finished the sentence with trembling care. Divinity implies purpose. What I observe is amusement. That night, the enchantress came to him not in dream, but in thought. He felt her settle into his mind as one might sink into a warm bath. His thoughts slowed, spread, rearranged. Concepts he had held sacred order, hierarchy, causality were lifted and examined like curiosities. You watch so intently, she murmured. Do you see yet? Emeric wept as he wrote. Day? I can no longer determine the sequence of events. Time behaves inconsistently. I write to anchor myself. If this journal ceases, I cease. His handwriting had degraded into sharp, stabbing lines. Ink blotted the page where his hand spasmed. The masks are not disguises. They are revelations. The peasants are closer to truth than we ever were. The forest does not corrupt, it remembers. A smear of blood obscured several words. I have begun to forget the face of my mother. Emeric attempted an experiment. He stood before a pool at dawn, journal in hand, and described what he saw as precisely as possible. The reflection showed him gaunt and ragged, his remaining eye fever-bright. Then the reflection smiled. Emeric wrote faster. Hallucinatory projection confirmed. Subject aware of unreality, yet compelled to respond emotionally. Classic. The reflection reached out and touched the surface of the water from inside. Emeric dropped the journal and ran. He was found hours later, half buried in leaf litter, scratching symbols into his own chest with a broken quill. He begged Sir Caldus to let him finish writing. Caldus refused. Emeric laughed until he choked. The final entries are barely legible. Sentences trail off. Words repeat obsessively. Margins are filled with crude drawings, crowns, eyes, spirals, a woman-shaped absence surrounded by thorns. One page reads only, "I see why you love her," over and over, until the ink runs dry. The last page is torn, but a fragment remains, stained dark and stiff. Reason was never light. It was a blindfold. She took it off. I am grateful. The journal was found nailed to a tree at the forest's edge, its pages fluttering gently in a wind that did not touch the leaves. No trace of Emeric Valancourt was ever recovered. Only the journal remained, and it was still writing. Chapter 8. The Forest That Watches. The forest was not merely a place, it was a presence. Those who still lived within its shadow came to understand this not as a revelation, but as a slow, crushing certainty, like realizing one has been watched for hours only after the watcher finally breathes. The woods did not rush. They did not need to. They had learned patience long before men learned to stack stone upon stone and call it permanence. By day, the forest seemed almost ordinary, if one ignored the details. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in sickly shafts, illuminating drifting motes that clung to skin and tongue like spores. Leaves rustled without wind. Branches leaned inward, bending at angles no living wood should endure, their tips curling like knuckles stiff with age. Trunks bore scars, deep cuts where axes had bitten, overgrown now with puckered bark that resembled scar tissue. Faces, if one looked long enough. Roots bulged from the earth in tangled masses, thick and ropey, looping over stones and sinking back into the soil. Some rose high enough to form crude arches, others hung from embankments like nooses, swaying gently even when the air lay still. Bones were caught among them, animal, human, too weathered to distinguish, woven into the rootwork as though the forest itself had learned to decorate. At night, the watching became unbearable. The trees shifted then, not uprooted, not striding like beasts of legend, but adjusting subtle, incremental movements that only became apparent when paths vanished and landmarks no longer aligned. A stump used as a marker would be gone by morning, replaced by a young sapling. Clearings shrank. Trails folded back upon themselves like intestines coiled in a gut. The forest remembered where men had trespassed. It remembered the sound of axes biting, the screams of trees dragged down and stripped, the smoke of charcoal pits and lime kilns. It remembered fields hacked from its flesh and sown with wheat, castles razed from stone quarried out of sacred hills. Every furrow ploughed, every wall mortared, every shrine erected in defiance of root and leaf, it remembered all of it. And it resented. Sir Caldus felt that resentment most keenly. He moved through the woods alone now, limping from his wound, breath ragged. The others had scattered, some taken by the revel, some fled screaming into the dark, some hanging silently from branches as offerings or warnings. Caldus did not know which fate was worse. He felt eyes upon him constantly, not eyes in the human sense, but awareness, pressure against the back of his skull, a tightening in the chest. When he paused, the forest paused with him. When he moved, branches creaked softly, acknowledging his passage. He passed beneath a massive oak whose limbs twisted overhead like grasping hands, each finger ending in a claw of dead leaves and lichen. As he walked beneath it, one branch dipped lower, brushing his shoulder with a whisper of bark and moss. It did not strike him. It measured him. Elsewhere, the forest fed. A band of peasants tried to flee La Charnay under cover of night, carrying torches and farm tools, their faces smeared with ash and fear. They made it less than a mile before the ground gave way beneath them. Roots burst upward like spears, impaling legs and bellies, lifting screaming bodies into the air. Branches bent and entwined, snapping necks with slow, deliberate pressure. One man managed to crawl free, dragging himself through the mud, sobbing prayers to gods who did not answer. A sapling bent over him, its thin trunk curving impossibly until its tip pressed gently against his forehead. A single thorn punched through his skull. The forest drank his blood eagerly, soil darkening, roots pulsing as though with satisfaction. In another place, stone met wood. A ruined watchtower, one of Bretonia's forgotten outposts, leaned at a dangerous angle where the forest had crept close. Ivy strangled its walls. Roots cracked its foundation stones apart with patient force. Inside, the skeletons of soldiers lay slumped against arrow slits. Armor rusted into the shape of their bones. The forest had not stormed the tower. It had waited. Every year, roots grew thicker. Stones shifted, mortar crumbled. The tower sagged, groaned, then finally collapsed inward with a sound like a sigh. Within hours, saplings sprouted from the rubble, their leaves already unfurling. The forest reclaimed what had been taken. Sir Aldrich, if that name still applied, hung from a tree not far from where the tower had fallen. His body had fused with the bark, limbs stretched and twisted, armor embedded in living wood. Roots wrapped his legs like shackles, holding him aloft. His face, warped and half equine, stared sightlessly outward, jaw frozen mid-prayer. Birds nested in his ribcage. The forest did not mock him. It simply used him. The enchantress watched all of this with idle interest, but even she did not command every motion. The forest was older than her amusement, deeper than her whims. She was its voice, not its will. Where she delighted in cruelty and spectacle, the forest concerned itself with balance, an accounting of wounds long unavenged. Wheat fields withered overnight. Beyond the tree line, crops blackened and collapsed, stalks bending as though pressed by invisible hands. Roots crept beneath the soil, strangling growth, pulling nutrients downward and away. Farmers woke to find their fields riddled with sinkholes, the earth yawning open to swallow plow and ox alike. Stone walls cracked. Castle keeps developed hairline fractures that bled sap. Moss spread across battlements overnight, thick enough to clog arrow slits. In one hamlet, a granary collapsed as a massive oak erupted through its floor, splitting the building in half, its branches thrusting upward through the roof like triumphal arms. The forest was advancing. Those who fled towards civilization fared no better. Roads became treacherous, paving stones pried up by roots, bridges warped and broken, milestones toppled and vanished, swallowed whole. The forest did not chase it, expanded, swallowing territory with glacial inevitability. Within its heart, the watching intensified. Caldus stumbled into a clearing he did not remember entering. The trees around it leaned inward, forming a crude amphitheater. Every branch pointed toward the center, every root curved like a finger accusing him. He felt suddenly small. "Come out," he rasped, unsure whether he addressed the enchantress or the forest itself. His voice sounded wrong here, swallowed by bark and leaf. The trees answered not with words, but with movement. Branches creaked and lowered, casting shadows that resembled reaching hands. Leaves shivered, producing a dry, whispering sound like countless mouths murmuring at once. Roots rose from the ground, coiling into shapes that suggested gallows, thrones, altars. Memory assaulted him. He saw castles he had defended, white stone rising from cleared land, banners snapping proudly above fields wrested from wilderness. He saw peasants cutting trees for hearth and home, never asking what was lost in the process. He saw himself standing watch, convinced of righteousness, blade in hand, never once wondering what watched back. The forest had watched. It had watched men arrive with fire and iron, watched them pray to distant gods while hacking sacred groves apart, watched them crown kings with wood cut from its oldest boughs. It had learned the shape of hatred slowly, patiently. A root lashed out, striking Caldus across the chest, flinging him to the ground. Another pinned his arm. Thorns pressed against his throat, drawing blood. He did not struggle. I know, he whispered. I know what we did. The pressure eased not mercy, but consideration. The forest bent closer, branches lowering until leaves brushed his face. He smelled sap and decay and rain-soaked earth. He felt the weight of centuries pressing down, the slow grind of time that rendered castles to rubble and bones to loam. This was not rage, this was memory. Caldus was released and left gasping in the mud, marked with thorn scratches that burned like brands. When he rose, the clearing was gone, paths rearranged. The forest had made its point. Elsewhere, the watching continued. Every step taken beneath the canopy was noted. Every breath exhaled, every drop of blood spilled, added to the forest's ledger. Nothing was forgotten, nothing forgiven. The forest did not hate mankind as men hated enemies. It hated them as one hates a disease, something invasive, multiplying, stripping land bare and calling it progress. Stone castles and wheat fields were not symbols of triumph, but scars. And now the forest had decided to heal. It would take time. It would take blood, but it had all the patience in the world, and it was watching. Chapter 9. The Duel Beneath the Hawthorn. The hawthorn stood alone in a clearing that should not have existed. It rose from the forest floor like a wound that refused to close, its trunk twisted and pale, bark split into spiraling ridges that bled sap the color of old milk. Its branches spread low and wide, heavy with thorns as long as daggers, each one glistening faintly as though wet. White blossoms clung to those thorns despite the season, their petals already browning at the edges, perfuming the air with a sweetness so thick it made the throat ache. Sir Etienne and Sir Marek arrived there separately, drawn by the same lie. Neither could later say how he had come to that place. Paths had dissolved behind them, memory trailing away like smoke. They knew only that they had to be there, that something waited, that something demanded. They saw each other across the clearing and stopped. For a moment, brief, fragile, they remembered what they had been, brothers in arms, shieldmates. Men who had bled side by side beneath banners now rotting in forgotten halls. Etienne remembered Marek hauling him from the mud after a lance shattered his collarbone. Marek remembered Etienne standing over him, sword slick with gore, when he could no longer lift his shield. Then the forest breathed. Between them, beneath the hawthorn, stood a woman, or the idea of one. She was tall and pale, her shape wavering as though seen through heat haze. Her hair spilled down her back in a cascade of black thorns and white flowers, some blooming, some rotting even as they opened. Her face was perfect and indistinct, features shifting subtly each time one looked away. Now a peasant girl with tear-streaked cheeks, now a noblewoman with a cruel smile, now someone both knights recognized, yet could not name. She wore no crown. She did not need one. Etienne felt his heart say, "There you are," he breathed, voice breaking. "I knew you would come back." Marek felt rage surge through him, hot and blinding. "She's mine," he snarled. "She promised herself to me." The woman smiled at both of them. The smile split her lips just enough to show thorns beneath. They spoke at once, then accusations tumbling over one another, half-remembered vows and imagined betrayals. Etienne accused Marek of stealing glances, of poisoning affection with silence and judgment. Marek accused Etienne of corruption, of turning love into indulgence, of wanting what he could not keep. Neither questioned whether she was real. She stepped back beneath the hawthorn's boughs, blossoms drifting down to settle in her hair and on her bare shoulders. Blood welled where thorns pierced her skin, running in thin rivulets that vanished before they reached the ground. "Prove it," she whispered. The words were barely audible. They rang louder than steel. Both knights drew their weapons. Etienne's blade was nicked and stained, its fuller clogged with sap and rust. His wolf mask grown, not worn, pulled his mouth into a permanent snarl, teeth bared. Marek's axe was heavier, its haft wrapped in cracked leather fused to his hands by creeping wood. His bull-like horns jutted forward from his skull mask, one cracked from some earlier violence. They circled one another slowly, boots scuffing damp earth, eyes never leaving their opponent. "Stand down," Etienne said hoarsely. "This isn't you." Marek laughed, a deep, broken sound. "Funny, I was about to say the same." The forest leaned closer. Dryads gathered at the edges of the clearing, slender, bark-skinned figures half emerged from tree trunks and roots. Their faces were smooth and cruelly beautiful, eyes bright with mirth. They whispered and giggled, hands clasped, placing wagers with nods and glances. Shapes moved higher in the branches, two unseen spectators shifting leaves and shadow, breathing softly in anticipation. The duel began without signal. Etienne lunged, faster than Marek expected, blade flashing in a savage cut aimed for the throat. Marek raised his axe just in time, steel ringing as weapons met. Sparks flew, not sparks of fire, but brief blooms of pale green light that hissed when they struck the ground. They broke apart, then clashed again. Etienne fought like a man possessed, every movement fueled by desperate longing. He struck wildly, overcommitting, trusting speed and fury to carry him through. Marek fought like stone, solid, relentless, absorbing blows and returning them with crushing force. A glancing strike tore through Etienne's side, splitting mail and flesh. Blood spilled, dark and steaming. He barely noticed. "You can't even remember her name," Marek growled, swinging low. "I remember how she made me feel." Etienne spat, barely leaping clear. "That's enough." They circled again, breath ragged, boots slipping in churned mud now streaked with blood and sap. The woman beneath the hawthorn watched, eyes shining. She clapped softly, encouraging. "Harder," she urged. "You both disappoint me." The forest echoed her laughter. Etienne feinted left and drove his sword into Marek's thigh. The blade bit deep, scraping bone. Marek roared, staggering, but then his horns caught Etienne in the chest, lifting him bodily and hurling him backward into the hawthorn's trunk. Thorns punched through Etienne's armor and into his flesh, pinning him there. He screamed as branches tightened, dragging him closer, embedding him in the tree like a grotesque offering. Marek limped forward, axe raised. For a heartbeat, doubt flickered in his eyes. "Yield," he said, voice thick. "This ends now." Etienne laughed, blood bubbling from his mouth. "You think she wants that?" The woman leaned close to Marek, her lips brushing his ear. "He would never yield for you," she whispered. "He never has." Marek's face hardened. He swung. Etienne tore himself free at the last moment, leaving strips of flesh behind. The axe buried itself in the hawthorn, splitting wood, with a shriek that sounded disturbingly like pain. Sap sprayed, thick and white, coating Marek's face and hands. The tree bled, the clearing shuddered, roots writhed beneath the soil, dryads shrieking with delight as the duel intensified. They danced now, spinning and clapping, their laughter rising in pitch. Leaves fell in a steady rain, each one slicing skin where it touched. Etienne charged again, driving Marek back step by step, blade hacking, thrusting, seeking gaps. One strike pierced Marek's shoulder, another slashed across his ribs. Blood ran freely, soaking his tabard. Marek roared and headbutted Etienne, horns crunching into his skull mask. Bone cracked. Etienne reeled Vision swimming. They grappled then, weapons forgotten, hands clawing at armor and flesh. They rolled in the mud beneath the hawthorn, punching, biting, snarling like beasts. Etienne drove his thumb into Marek's eye socket. Marek crushed Etienne's windpipe with one massive hand. The woman screamed, not in fear, in delight. "Kill him!" she cried to each of them. Marek gained the upper hand at last, pinning Etienne to the ground, knee crushing his chest. He raised his axe, hands shaking not from weakness, but from the effort of restraint. "Look at you," he said softly. "You don't even know why you're fighting." Etienne's eye cleared just enough to see past Marek to the hawthorn. The woman was gone. There was only the tree now, its branches heavy with thorns and corpses half swallowed by bark, faces twisted in ecstasy and agony alike. No woman, no prize, only the forest, watching. "Neither do you," Etienne whispered. Marek hesitated. That was enough. Etienne drove a broken thorn up under Marek's chin, through tongue and palate, into the brain. Marek convulsed once, blood spraying in a red arc across the clearing, then went slack. The axe fell from his hands. The forest went quiet. Dryads pouted, disappointment flickering across their faces. Some hissed softly, retreating back into bark and root. Leaves settled. The unseen spectators withdrew, appetite briefly sated. Etienne rolled off the corpse and lay gasping, staring up at the hawthorn. Blood soaked into the earth beneath him, joining Marek's in a dark, widening stain. The woman reappeared above him, seated among the branches. She looked almost bored. "You chose poorly," she said. "But you chose." She leaned down and kissed Etienne's forehead. Thorns burst from the point of contact, flooding his skull with white-hot pain. His scream echoed through the forest as bark crept over his face, sealing his mouth open in a final, eternal howl. By morning, the hawthorn bore 2 new growths, one shaped like a kneeling bull, one shaped like a snarling wolf, and the forest remembered them both. Chapter 10. The Peasant King for a Night. His name had been Colin, once, Colin of the Lowfields, Colin the Thresh-hand, Colin who bent his back beneath another man's land and thanked the lady for the privilege of hunger. He had known the weight of sacks and the sting of overseers' whips, the arithmetic of grain measured always against tax and tithe. His hands were thick with callous, his spine permanently bowed, his dreams small and careful. The forest stripped that name from him as easily as it stripped flesh from bone. On the night of his coronation, Colin was dragged from a root cellar where he had hidden with 2 others, clutching a rusted sickle and praying to gods who had never learned his face. Vines burst through the packed earth walls, splitting them like rotten bread. Hands seized him too many, too strong, and hauled him screaming into the open. The revel was already in full bloom. The woodland hall had reshaped itself again, larger than before, grander in its obscenity. Columns of living wood twisted skyward, their surfaces inlaid with faces frozen mid-laugh or mid-scream. Lanterns of foxfire and fungus cast a lurid glow over a crowd swollen with new bodies, peasants, deserters, pilgrims, even a few knights whose armor had grown into their flesh like penitential cages. Music thundered from everywhere at once, a rhythm that hammered against the heart and dragged the body along with it. Colin was thrown into the center. He landed hard, breath driven from his lungs, and lay there gasping as the revelers parted around him. Masks turned toward him, stags, boars, birds, insect things with too many eyes. Some were crude, others elegant, all inseparable from the flesh beneath. Their laughter washed over him in waves, hot and wet and eager. A root rose behind him, coiling upward like a serpent. Upon it descended the crown. It was wrought of thorns and splintered bone, woven together with strands of hair, human hair, still attached in places to scraps of scalp. Small flowers bloomed along its curve, white and red, opening eagerly as it settled upon Colin's brow. The thorns bit deep, puncturing skin and skull alike. Blood ran down his face, blinding him. The pain was exquisite. He screamed, and the scream turned into laughter. The enchantress appeared then, reclining upon a throne of bark and ivory, her posture languid, her smile indulgent. She wore no regalia, for she required none. Her gaze fixed upon Colin with open amusement. "Behold," she proclaimed, her voice silencing the music with a gesture. "Your king." The revelers roared. Hands seized Colin, hauling him upright, forcing his head high despite the crown's agony. Roots wrapped around his legs and arms, lifting him above the crowd. The pain faded, replaced by warmth. No, not warmth, rightness. Something settled into him, filling hollows he had not known existed. Hefeld, important. The enchantress clapped, slow and mocking. "You have knelt all your life," she said. "Tonight you shall stand above them." She gestured, and a scepter was thrust into his hand, a length of polished femur capped with a skull no larger than a child's, its eye sockets filled with glowing sap. When his fingers closed around it, the skull's jaw clicked open in a silent laugh. Power surged through him. The crowd knelt, not willingly. Roots snapped up from the ground, forcing bodies down, bending spines until foreheads pressed into the muck. Knights and peasants alike groaned as unseen forces compelled obedience. Colin stared down at them, heart pounding, breath coming fast. They were looking at him, waiting. "What would you have of them, my king?" the enchantress asked sweetly. Colin's mouth worked soundlessly. He had never been asked such a thing. Orders had always flowed down to him, never up. His thoughts raced, clumsy and desperate, until something whispered within him soft, coaxing. "Make them know what you knew." He laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Make them crawl," he said. The forest obeyed. Roots seized the revelers, dragging them forward on bellies and knees. Armor scraped, masks cracked, blood smeared the ground. Knights who had once ridden in splendor groveled in the filth, their animal faces contorted with rage and humiliation. Colin's chest swelled. "Sing," he commanded. Their mouths opened, and sound poured out, not song, but sobbing, pleading, broken prayers forced into crude harmony. The music warped around their voices, turning misery into rhythm. Colin felt the sound vibrate through him, a physical thing, intoxicating. He raised the scepter. "Punish them," he said. The revelers surged to their feet, seizing one another at random. A knight was torn apart by peasants whose children he had once taxed into starvation. A woman was trampled beneath hooves and claws, her screams swallowed by laughter. Blood flowed freely, soaking into the soil around Colin's feet, feeding the roots that held him aloft. He laughed until his throat burned. They dressed him next. Leaves and petals were pressed into his torn clothes, roots winding around his limbs like ceremonial chains. His back straightened as bark crept up his spine, reinforcing him, reshaping him into something that could bear a crown. The pain was distant now, muffled by pleasure. "You wear it well," the enchantress murmured, circling him. "Tell me, King, what is your law?" Colin thought of grain quotas, of lashes, of cold winters and empty bellies. "More," he said simply. "I want more." Her smile widened, so the revel escalated. Colin ordered games, mock trials where verdicts were death, jousts fought with broken bodies instead of lances, feasts where the meat screamed as it was eaten. He named new nobles from the crowd at random, then had them executed for imagined slights. He demanded oaths and broke them moments later, delighting in the confusion. For the first time in his life, he was not afraid. But power borrowed rots quickly. As the night wore on, the crown began to tighten. The thorns pushed deeper, scraping bone. Sap seeped into his skull, clouding thought. The whispers grew louder, less coaxing, more insistent. "Dance," they urged. "Amuse us." The enchantress watched with half-lidded eyes, her interest waning. "You forget yourself," she said lightly. Colin snarled at her. "I am king!" Laughter rippled through the hall, not the wild laughter of revelers, but something colder, sharper. "Oh?" she replied, standing at last. "You were." The music stopped. The roots released him. Colin fell hard, striking the ground in a tangle of limbs and regalia. The scepter shattered beside him, the skull splitting open with a wet crack. He scrambled to his feet, panic rising as the crowd closed in. "Get back!" he shouted. "Kneel! I command!" The crown tightened. Thorns punched through his temples. His vision exploded into white. He screamed as the roots that had supported him now wrapped around his limbs, yanking him upward once more, not in honor, but display. The revelers laughed. The enchantress approached, plucking the crown from his head with a delicate tug. Blood poured down his face, his features already swelling and stiffening. "You ruled as you were taught," she said almost kindly. Briefly, cruelly, without mercy, she placed the crown upon her own brow for a heartbeat, then tossed it aside like refuse. "Now you will serve." The roots pulled him apart, not quickly. Never quickly. His arms were stretched wide, joints tearing free with wet pops. His legs followed, spine elongating impossibly as bark erupted through splitting skin. His mouth was forced open in a rictus grin, teeth cracking as sap flooded his throat. He did not die at once. The revelers danced beneath him as he screamed, his blood raining down upon them like blessing. When his voice finally failed, his eyes still moved, tracking the enchantress as she turned away. By dawn, there was nobody left, only a new arch at the hall's entrance, fashioned from bark, bone, and something that had once been a man. His face, stretched and fixed in laughter, stared eternally outward. The forest had crowned its king, and then it had remembered what kings were for. Chapter 11. The Enchantress's Lament. The revel ended not with dawn, but with exhaustion. Music thinned to a trembling thread, and then unraveled entirely. Lantern fungi dimmed, their glow guttering like dying embers. Roots loosened their grip and sank back into the soil, slick with blood and sap. Bodies, those still whole enough to be called bodies, lay strewn across the forest floor in obscene repose. Masks cracked, limbs bent at angles no living thing should endure. Steam rose from the ground where warmth met cold earth, carrying with it the copper stench of slaughter and the sweeter, cloying perfume of crushed flowers. In that lull, that rare and dangerous quiet, the forest held its breath. Sir Caldus lay at the edge of a clearing that had once been a road, his chest rising in shallow, painful gasps. He had lost track of how many nights had passed. Time here was a rumour, a suggestion whispered by pain and hunger. His wound had crusted over with a mixture of blood and sap, hard as amber, binding muscle to bark where the forest had begun, gently and inexorably, to claim him. He did not rise when footsteps approached. They were soft, unhurried, not bothering to hide. The enchantress emerged from between two ancient yews, and for once she did not shift or blur. She wore a single shape, as if the act of choosing it mattered. She was tall and pale, her skin the color of moonlit ash, her limbs long and spare. Thorns traced her silhouette along her arms, her hips, her throat piercing flesh that bled slowly, languidly, staining her white with red. Her crown was gone. In its place, her hair fell loose, heavy and dark, tangled with leaves and small bones. Her eyes were not filled with starlight now, but shadow deep, tired shadow, like hollows left after fire. She stopped a few paces from Caldus and regarded him without mirth. "You live?" she said. Her voice was softer than it had ever been, not gentle, never gentle, but stripped of its layered mockery, its cruel music. It sounded old. "Against your wishes?" Caldus rasped. A corner of her mouth twitched. "Against mine." She seated herself upon a fallen log, bark splitting beneath her weight. When she rested her hands upon her knees, roots crept up to cradle her fingers, as though the forest itself sought to comfort her. She did not look at him as she spoke next, but out into the trees, into distances no mortal eye could measure. "Do you know what this place was?" she asked. Caldus coughed, blood flecking his lips. "A forest." Her laughter, when it came, was brief and bitter. "That is what it is now." She closed her eyes, and the forest answered. Leaves stilled, branches ceased their restless creaking. Even the insects fell silent. In that hush, memory poured into the clearing like floodwater. Caldus saw it, not with his eyes, but with something deeper, more vulnerable. The forest as it had been, not a maze of choking roots and grasping thorns, but a cathedral of green and gold. Sunlight filtered cleanly through vast canopies, untouched by blade or fire. The air thrummed with life, birds, beasts, spirits whose names had no human syllables. Stone had no dominion here. There were no roads, no fences, no shrines bleeding rust into the soil. Men came then, too, but not as conquerors. They came barefoot, bearing offerings of grain and song, laying down their weapons at the forest's edge. They listened, they learned, they spoke names that were answered. The enchantress walked among them, openly in those days, crowned in flowers that did not draw blood, her laughter bright and terrible and honest. "This was a place of exchange," she said, "of balance. You took what you were given, and you gave what you could. Blood, sometimes, always blood, but never greed." Her voice tightened. "Then your kings came." The vision darkened. Axes rang. Trees fell screaming, their spirits tearing free as they died. Fire devoured groves that had stood since before memory. Men built altars of stone and named them holy. driving iron nails into living trunks to hang their symbols. They prayed louder and louder, drowning out the forest's voice, insisting that their choosed gods were masters here now. "They hunted us," she whispered, "not for hunger, for sport, for proof." Calder saw dryads dragged from their trees and butchered like animals, spirits bound into talismans and burned to ash when they refused obedience, groves salted, springs choked with corpses, the enchantress's hands clenched, thorns biting deep. Blood dripped to the ground, and where it fell, flowers blackened. "They said we were lies," she went on, "that we were demons, that your lady, your distant, pale idol had claimed this land, as if a thing can be owned because it is named." Her eyes opened then, fixing on Caldus with terrible intensity. "I watched them raise castles from the bones of my sisters," she hissed. "I watched wheat choke the soil where sacred roots once ran. I watched children taught to fear the dark, not because it was cruel, but because it remembered." Caldus said nothing. There was nothing left to say. She rose, pacing now, agitation rippling through her like wind through leaves. As she moved, the forest responded, branches bending, roots surfacing, the ground trembling faintly beneath each step. "I waited," she said. "I waited while your banners spread, while your prayers drowned us out, while you forgot our names and then forgot that forgetting had a cost." She stopped before him, looming. "And then," she murmured, "you returned?" Her gaze flicked briefly to the carnage surrounding them. "Not with reverence, not with humility, with iron and vows and certainty." Her sorrow twisted then, curdling into something vicious. "So I reminded you." She spread her arms wide, and the forest answered with a low, thunderous groan. "I taught you the language you understand best," she said. "Pain, hierarchy, mockery. I crowned your peasants and made your knights crawl. I turned love into a blade and memory into rot. I took your stories and finished them. For the first time," something like doubt flickered across her face. "Did you think I enjoyed it?" she asked quietly. Caldus met her gaze. "You enjoyed parts of it?" She smiled, slow and sharp. Yes, the admission did not absolve her. It condemned her further. "I am not innocent," she said. "I never was. I am old, and I am cruel, and I remember every wound. Revenge is a kind of mourning. It is the only one left to me. She knelt before him then, lowering herself until they were eye to eye. Her breath smelled of crushed leaves and blood. "But do not mistake sorrow for mercy," she continued. "I will not stop because you suffer. I will stop when the forest is heard again." She reached out and touched his chest, fingers sinking into the hardened sap that bound his wound. "You," she said softly, "are an accident." The forest rustled, uneasy. "You should have died," she went on, "or danced, or rooted. You were meant to become an example or a lesson." Hair fingers tightened, pain flared, blinding. "But you listened." Caldus gritted his teeth, refusing to scream. She withdrew her hand, studying the blood and sap clinging to her skin. "Go," she said at last, standing. "Carry this with you, if you can still carry anything. Tell them why the forest screams." She turned away, already receding into shadow, her shape beginning to blur once more. "Tell them," her voice echoed, layered and distant again, "that sorrow grows teeth." The forest exhaled. Roots shifted, paths realigned. Somewhere far away, stone cracked. Caldus lay alone in the aftermath, the weight of her lament settling over him heavier than any wound. Around him, The forest resumed its watching, older now, sadder, and no less hungry. And in that stillness, he understood the final cruelty of her grief. She did not want forgiveness. She wanted to be remembered. Chapter 12. The Breaking of the Glamour. The glamour did not shatter like glass. It thinned. It frayed at the edges, threads unraveling one by one, revealing not clarity but absence, raw gaps where meaning had been peeled away. The forest did not scream when it began. It hesitated, leaves stilled mid-rustle. Roots paused in their slow, patient constriction. Even the ever-present laughter faltered, as though the woods themselves were unsure whether the joke had gone too far. Curdles stood alone at the place where paths forgot themselves. It was not a clearing, nor a crossroads, but a confusion of both tree trunks arranged too neatly, stones set as if for ritual, the ground worn smooth by feet that had walked there in circles for centuries. The air tasted thin, metallic, like rain about to fall or blood about to spill. Above him, the canopy formed a dome so dense it might have been a roof grown rather than built. Here, the glamour pressed hardest. Images slid over one another in his vision, faces of the dead, half-remembered banners, lovers whose names he could no longer recall. His reflection appeared everywhere at once, in polished bark, in beads of sap, in the dark eyes of watching things half buried in wood and soil. Each reflection showed him differently: knight, murderer, penitent, beast, none were lies. All were traps. He felt the forest urging him to choose. Choose a story. Choose a name. Choose a sin to cling to, a virtue to justify it. Choose identity, so it could be taken and worn and twisted like all the others. The enchantress did not appear, but her presence lay heavy as a hand between his shoulder blades. Be something, the glamour whispered. Be mine. Curdles closed his eyes. He thought of the oaths he had once sworn, words polished smooth by repetition, meant to hold a man upright against chaos. He thought of the honor he had broken, the brother he had killed in a fit of righteous certainty. He thought of the love he had lost, not to death, but to his own refusal to forgive. All of it was weight. All of it was bait. Slowly, deliberately, he began to strip it away. He unbuckled his sword belt and let the blade fall to the ground. The sound rang too loudly, echoing through the trees like a challenge unanswered. The sword lay there, steel already dulling, rust blooming along its edge as roots crept closer, eager. I was never what it named me, he said aloud, his voice rough. Speaking felt dangerous here, like cutting into living flesh, but he continued. Knight, brother, beloved, those were shapes other people pressed onto me. The forest leaned closer, branch dipped, roots stirred. Curdles reached up and tore the iron ring from his finger, the last token of a vow he had not kept. It resisted, biting into skin, but he wrenched it free and flung it aside. Blood welled, ran down his hand, pattering onto the soil. Something in the air tensed. Memories surged, violent and insistent. He saw himself again as he had been proud, armored, certain. He felt the rush of battle, the righteousness of judgment, the warmth of another body pressed against his in stolen moments. The glamour tried to drown him in significance, to convince him that these things were all that remained of him. He laughed, then a dry, humorless sound. No, he said, they are not. He knelt and pressed his bleeding hand into the earth. The pain was immediate and sharp as thorns erupted from the soil, piercing flesh, winding around his wrist and forearm. Sap mingled with blood, sticky and hot. The forest tested him, as it tested all things, probing, measuring, seeking resistance. He did not pull away. "I give you my name," Caldus whispered. "I give you the story I tell myself when I want to sleep at night. I give you the lie that I mattered more than what I did." The roots tightened. He felt something tear, not muscle or bone, but self. The part of him that reached for titles and justifications screamed as it was peeled back. His thoughts blurred. For a terrifying moment, he could not remember why he knelt there at all. The glamour wavered. The enchantress appeared not whole, but fractured across the space around him. Her face shimmered in the curve of a branch, in the dark hollow of a stump, in the surface of his own blood pooled on the ground. Her expression was no longer amused. "What are you doing?" she asked, and for the first time there was no mockery in her voice. Caldus looked up, though his vision swam. "Nothing," he said. "That's the point." She recoiled, as if struck. Around them, the forest groaned. Leaves fell in a sudden rain. Masks, those grown horrors of bark and bone, cracked where revelers still wore them, splitting apart, sloughing off in wet, painful strips. Somewhere distant, something howled in confusion and rage. "You cannot give up what you are," the enchantress said sharply. "Without self, there is no will. Without will, you are meat." Caldus smiled faintly. "Then let me be meat." He pressed his other hand into the earth. The pain doubled, tripled, became a white-hot flood that burned away thought. Roots pierced his palms, climbed his arms, wrapped his chest. His spine bowed under the pressure, and for a moment it seemed the forest would simply take him, root him, claim him, turn him into another silent monument to suffering. But something broke. Not violently, not cleanly. The glamour slipped. It was like a song losing its melody, like laughter trailing off into embarrassed silence. The enchantress staggered, her form blurring wildly, unable to hold a single shape. The forest's movements grew, erratic branches jerking, roots withdrawing and surging without rhythm. The illusions peeled away. Masks fell, revealing faces beneath ruined, scarred, human. Knights and peasants alike collapsed where they stood, screaming as sensation returned, as memory rushed back without the glamour's cushioning warmth. Some clawed at their faces in horror at what they had become. Others simply lay still, weeping. The enchantress screamed then, not in pain, in loss. "You would make yourself nothing," she shrieked, her voice splintering. "Just to deny me?" Caldus did not answer. He could not have, even if he wished. The roots held him fast, and his thoughts were unraveling, slipping through his grasp like water. Names meant nothing now. Past and future were distant concepts, barely comprehensible. But the glamour continued to falter. The forest hesitated again, that ancient pause stretching long and taut. Without the enchantress's careful shaping, her cruel artistry, the wood seemed suddenly uncertain, like a predator deprived of its favorite method of killing. The enchantress backed away, clutching at her head as thorns burst and withered along her arms. "You do not understand what you are unmaking," she hissed. "Without stories, without roles, you are nothing to remember." A final spasm tore through Caldus's body as the roots released him. He collapsed face first into the mud, gasping, shuddering, his mind a blank, painful echo. The forest around him withdrew a fraction, branches lifting, roots sinking back beneath the soil. The watching did not cease, but it changed. Silence spread. Not peace, never peace, but quiet. The enchantress stood at the edge of that quiet, her form unstable, her power diminished but far from gone. She looked at the broken man on the ground with something like hatred and something uncomfortably close to fear. "You have paid," she said coldly. "More than you know." She turned away, dissolving into bark and shadow, her presence retreating deeper into the woods, where the glamour still clung in tatters. When dawn came thin and grey and reluctant, it found Curdles alive, but hollowed. He woke without knowing his name, his rank, his sins, or his loves. He knew only breath and pain and the simple fact of existence. Around him lay the aftermath. Bodies broken but no longer reshaped. Masks scattered like shed skins. The forest quieter, wounded, watchful. The glamour had broken, not because it was defeated, but because someone had refused to be someone at all. The cost was absolute, and the forest, ancient and resentful, began already to consider what price it would demand next. Chapter 13. Dawn, like a funeral shroud. Dawn came without triumph. There was no chorus of birds to greet it, no gold spilling through the canopy in benediction. The light arrived, thin and colourless. A sickly grey seeped into the forest as though the night had merely loosened its grip rather than released it. Mist lay heavy upon the ground, clinging to roots and corpses alike, winding through the trees like burial cloth, drawn slowly over a face. Those who lived awoke as the dead do, confused, broken, and unwilling. A man stirred beneath a fallen branch, groaning softly. His hair, once dark, was white as frost, his skin sagging and liver spotted as though decades had been pressed into a single night. His hands shook uncontrollably as he pushed himself upright, joints cracking like old timber. He looked around with dim, unfocused eyes, mouth working soundlessly, unable to remember where he was or when. Nearby, a woman lay curled against the base of a tree, her knees drawn to her chest. She stared at the sky through the canopy, eyes unblinking, lips moving in silent repetition. When another survivor approached and spoke to her, she did not react. When he touched her shoulder, she screamed a raw, animal sound and bit through his fingers to the bone. She could not speak of what she had seen. Others could speak, but did not wish to. They woke scattered across the forest floor, amid shattered masks, torn flesh, and the remnants of revelry now stripped of glamour. What had once been transformed monstrosities were now simply people again, or what was left of them, bark peeled from skin in wet, ragged sheets, leaving raw muscle beneath. Antlers cracked and fell away, tearing scalp and skull with them. Wings collapsed into useless tangles of bone and sinew. Each shedding was agony, but agony grounded them in a world that no longer bent to cruel whim. The forest watched in silence. Some survivors crawled from root thickets, clutching stumps where limbs had been torn away. Others woke half-buried in loam, lungs filled with damp earth, hacking and retching until blood flecked the mud. A few did not wake at all, faces peaceful, eyes open, mouths curved into faint smiles that suggested the night had offered them something they had chosen not to relinquish. Those bodies were already being reclaimed. Roots nudged their limbs, gentle as lovers' fingers. Leaves drifted down to cover faces. By the time the sun rose a little higher, it was difficult to tell where corpse ended and forest began. In the ruins of the revel hall, the damage was clearer. What had been towering arches of living wood now sagged, structures collapsing inward as though ashamed of their own excess. Columns split and bled sap freely, the liquid dark and sluggish. Lantern fungi shriveled and died, their glow extinguished, leaving only bruised darkness beneath the canopy. At the center of it all stood the hawthorn arch. Once a place of mockery and display, it now loomed as a monument to what had been lost. The faces embedded in its bark, knights, peasants, revelers frozen in laughter, had begun to crack. Features sloughed away, leaving indistinct hollows. Memory itself seemed to be eroding there, as though even the forest found the weight of remembrance too great. A small group of survivors gathered at the edge of that clearing, drawn by instinct rather than intention. They did not recognize one another. A former knight, his armor warped and half fused to his body, sat with his back against a stump, staring at his hands as though they belonged to someone else. He turned them over slowly, flexed his fingers, then pressed them against his face, weeping when they did not feel right. A peasant boy no more than 12 sat nearby, rocking back and forth. His hair had fallen out in clumps, leaving his scalp raw and bleeding. He hummed tunelessly, the echo of some rhythm that would not leave him. When asked his name, he shook his head violently and screamed until his voice broke. An old woman wandered through the clearing, bent nearly double, her spine twisted into an unnatural curve. She carried a wreath of thorns, cradled like an infant, crooning softly to it. No one tried to take it from her. They had learned what happened when such things were disturbed. Language itself seemed wounded. Words came slowly, painfully, if at all. Survivors struggled to describe what they had endured, only to find their mouths refusing cooperation. Sentences dissolved into fragments. Memories slipped away mid-thought, leaving only emotion behind: fear, longing, shame, relief. Some spoke in metaphors without understanding them. Others could only point, gesture, sob. When one man tried to speak the name of the forest, blood ran from his nose and ears until he collapsed, twitching. A few attempted prayer. They knelt in the mud, hands clasped, lips moving through half-remembered litanies. The words felt wrong in their mouths, hollow, distant. No warmth answered them. No reassurance came. If any god listened, it did so in silence. Above them, the forest loomed wounded, diminished, but still vast. Branches hung lower now, as though burdened by age. Leaves were duller, their green leached of vibrancy. Where the glamour had torn reality open, scars remained, patches of earth where nothing grew, places where the air felt thin and wrong. The enchantress did not appear. Some survivors were grateful for that. Others feared it meant she was only waiting. Toward the forest's edge, a man without a name stirred. He lay face down in the mud, body crisscrossed with wounds that had begun to scab over in ugly, uneven patterns. His hands were pierced and swollen, fingers stiff with pain. When he rolled onto his back, he squinted at the sky, confused by its brightness. He did not know who he was. That fact did not frighten him. What frightened him was the emptiness, the sense that something vast had been carved out of him and left behind a hollow that would never fill. He knew how to breathe, how to stand, how to walk. He knew pain. He knew hunger. But beyond that, there was nothing to anchor him. He rose unsteadily and began to walk. Roots parted for him, not in welcome, but acknowledgement. The forest did not bar his path, nor did it guide him. It simply allowed him to pass, as one allows a scar to remain rather than reopen it. Behind him, survivors continued to awaken. Some aged further as the morning wore on, bodies failing as the borrowed vitality of the night abandoned them. A man who had risen strong collapsed hours later, bones crumbling within him like dry leaves. A woman's teeth fell out as she tried to eat, gums bleeding freely. The forest exacted its delayed toll with indifferent precision. Others were marked in subtler ways. A knight found that metal burned his skin now, armor blistering him on contact. A peasant could no longer step onto tilled soil without retching violently, as though the earth itself rejected him. Several survivors cast no shadow at all, their forms faintly translucent in the pale light. None of them were whole. As the sun climbed higher, the mist began to lift, revealing the full extent of the devastation. Trees lay shattered and uprooted where violence had peaked. Clearings were gouged into the earth, ringed with splintered trunks and blackened soil. Blood stained everything, dark and sticky, attracting clouds of flies that buzzed lazily in the air, and yet life persisted. Tiny shoots pushed up through disturbed earth. Insects crept from hiding. Somewhere deep within the woods, a bird called once, tentatively, as though testing whether it was safe to exist again. The dawn did not cleanse. It catalogued. It laid bare what the night had done, and left the survivors to reckon with it in full, merciless clarity. There would be no forgetting this by daylight, no comforting lie that it had all been dream or madness. This was the cost. By midday, those who could walk began to drift away from the forest, drawn toward distant roads and half-remembered homes. They did not travel together. Community had been one of the first things devoured. Each walked alone, carrying wounds no one else could see and memories no one else could bear to hear. Those who remained behind, those who could not or would not leave, sat quietly beneath the trees, waiting. The forest watched them go. It did not pursue. It did not forgive. It simply stood, vast and ancient, its silence heavy with unresolved grief. The glamour was broken, but the wound remained, and wounds, left untended, fester. Dawn passed like a funeral shroud drawn slowly away from the face of the dead. What lay beneath was not rebirth, it was survival, and for many, even that would prove too much. Chapter 14. The forest endures. They left in fragments. There was no march, no orderly withdrawal beneath banners snapping proudly in the wind. No trumpet sounded to mark survival as victory. What passed for retreat was a slow, shame-heavy bleeding away from the forest's edge, small knots of men limping down half-remembered roads, solitary figures stumbling through fields they no longer recognized, wounded souls carrying ruin inward toward the heart of Bretonnia, of the knights who had ridden out with vows on their lips and steel on their backs. Only 3 emerged from the green shadow with breath still in their lungs. None rode. Sir Aldrich did not return at all, save as rumor and nightmare. His name was spoken only once, then swallowed by silence. Mothers hushed children who asked why the trees near La Charnay bore a shape like a kneeling horse. No prayers were offered for his soul. None were thought sufficient. Sir Etienne and Sir Marek were spoken of together, but never clearly. Their duel beneath the hawthorn passed quickly into whispered half-truths, 2 knights who had slain one another over a witch, or a woman, or a sin neither could name. No one admitted the truth that lingered in the eyes of those who had seen the tree afterward, that the forest itself had judged them both, and found no difference worth sparing. That left Sir Caldus, or what remained of him. He emerged from the forest at dusk 3 days after the glamour broke, barefoot and blood-caked, his armor abandoned somewhere among the roots. He walked like a man twice his age, spine bowed, steps measured and cautious, as though the ground itself might betray him. His hair had gone white at the temples. His eyes were hollow, stripped of expectation or fear. When the villagers of the nearest hamlet saw him approach, they barred their doors. They recognized something in him they did not wish to name. Caldus did not knock. He did not beg. He sat in the dirt outside their palisade until morning, unmoving, breathing shallowly. When at last the reeve approached with a spear and a prayer to the lady, Caldus looked up with no recognition in his gaze. "What is your name?" the reeve demanded. Caldus opened his mouth. Nothing came. The reeve recoiled, as though struck. They gave him bread and water in silence, and sent him on his way before the sun climbed too high. No blessing followed him, no curse either. He was not a man to be claimed by either. Further along the road, others straggled out, men-at-arms, stripped of insignia, squires whose eyes had aged decades overnight, a single knight whose tabard hung in tatters, and whose left hand shook uncontrollably whenever he neared a tree. None spoke freely of what had happened. When pressed, they offered contradictions: madness, heresy, daemons, forest spirits, punishment for sin. All were true. None were enough. The church took notice, as it always did when fear ripened. Priests arrived bearing censers and holy writ, their robes clean and their expressions tight with practiced concern. They walked the outskirts of the forest only, never crossing beneath the canopy, and proclaimed the land cursed. They nailed warnings to trees they dared not touch, inscribed with prayers that cracked and peeled within days. The forest did not answer them. It did not need to. Peasants returned to old habits with renewed devotion. Charms of iron and rowan appeared on door frames. Children were forbidden from playing near tree lines. Offerings, milk, bread, small coins were left at the forest's edge, not to placate the lady, but to appease something else, something unnamed and older. Superstition blossomed where reason had died screaming. Fields nearest the forest were abandoned entirely, wheat left to rot rather than harvested. Hunters refused to pursue game that fled beneath the trees, even in times of hunger. Wolves multiplied, bold and unafraid, their howls echoing at night with unsettling cadence. No one cut wood any more without apology. Axes were struck into bark with whispered prayers and drawn back quickly, as though the act itself might be overheard. Some men swore the trees bled sap shaped like letters when wounded. Others claimed they felt hands brushing their backs when they turned away from the forest too abruptly. The road that once passed through La Charnay fell into disuse. The village itself did not last the winter. Those who survived the revel and the dawn lingered only long enough to bury the dead, or what remained of them. Several simply walked into the forest one night and did not return, leaving behind homes half-packed and fires gone cold. The rest scattered to neighboring settlements, carrying fear like contagion. Within a year, La Charnay stood empty. Roofs collapsed, weeds choked the well, roots cracked foundations apart with slow persistence. Birds nested in the rafters of the shrine to the lady, their droppings streaking the stone face until her features were nearly erased. The forest crept closer. It did not advance with malice now, nor with revelry. It simply grew. Saplings rose in abandoned fields, ivy swallowed walls, roads cracked and vanished beneath moss and loam. The land reclaimed itself with quiet inevitability, and always it watched. Travelers who skirted the forest's edge swore they felt eyes upon them, countless and patient. Some reported seeing figures among the trees at twilight, tall and slender, or bent and rooted, or wearing faces too familiar to bear. None who entered the woods deliberately returned unchanged. A few did not return at all. Bards tried to sing of it once, in taverns where ale dulled the edge of dread. Their verses faltered midway, words slipping away, melodies turning sour in their mouths. One was found days later, with his tongue torn out, his fingers gnawed to bone, his lute smashed against a tree trunk. The song was never finished. As for the enchantress, she was not seen again, not as she had been. Her laughter no longer rang through the woods at night, and the great revels did not resume. The masks lay scattered and rotting where they had fallen, bark splitting and crumbling into mulch. But her presence lingered. Flowers bloomed where blood had soaked deepest. Thorns grew thicker along certain paths, forming crude crowns around old stumps and standing stones. Sometimes, at dusk, the wind carried a voice soft, distant, neither mocking nor kind, reciting names no one remembered belonging to anyone. The forest had been wounded. It had also been heard. That changed nothing and everything. Knights spoke of the affair only in confession, and even then with great care. No lord sought glory there again. No banners were raised. Official records referred to the region as strategically irrelevant and quietly redirected patrols elsewhere. But fear does not need sanction to thrive. Parents taught their children new prayers, not to the lady, but against the trees. Farmers swore oaths never to plow beyond certain stones. Travelers carried extra coin to pay for longer routes, avoiding the forest entirely even when it meant hunger or delay. And sometimes, rarely, a man or woman would wake from sleep with the taste of sap in their mouth and a memory they could not place, of dancing barefoot on moss, of laughter without joy, of a crown pressing painfully into the skull. They would rise, trembling, and swear never to go near the forest again. Most kept that vow. A few did not. The forest endured. It stood through seasons of rain and frost, through years of neglect and whispered dread. It lost nothing. It could not regrow. It forgot nothing it had taken. Stone castles crumbled with time. Wheat fields turned back to loam. Names faded from records and mouths alike. But the forest remained quieter now, watchful, scarred but not broken, waiting. For memory is a kind of hunger, and the woods had learned patience long before men learned fear. Chapter 15. A warning set to ink. The manuscript was found wrapped in oilcloth and buried beneath the hearthstones of a ruined chapel 3 leagues from where La Charnay once stood. No name marked its cover. The leather was old, cracked, darkened by smoke and something that might once have been blood. The pages within were uneven, some vellum, some cheap paper, some scraps sewn in later by a hand that lacked the patience or the time to do better. Margins were crowded with cramped notes, corrections, frantic symbols. In several places, words had been violently scratched out, replaced with others written so hard the nib had torn the page. What follows is a faithful transcription, errors preserved. Where ink had run or pages were damaged, the gaps remain. To whoever finds this, if you are reading by firelight, stop. If you are reading near trees, leave. If you are reading because you are curious, burn this and forget you ever held it. I did not. I was not so wise. I write because memory rots faster than flesh, and what is forgotten returns wearing a kinder face. I write because I have seen what laughter hides when it has no throat to belong to. I write because ink, at least, does not smile back. This is not a chronicle of heroism. There were no heroes. There were men who thought themselves strong and learned and chosen, and there were peasants who believed endurance was virtue enough to protect them. The forest devoured both, without distinction. Do not believe the lies that will grow around this place. They will tell you it was a witch. They will tell you it was a demon. They will tell you it was punishment for impiety, or heresy, or peasant ignorance. All of that is comfortable. Comfort is what it uses to get close. The truth, if such a thing can still be written, is this. The forest was awake, and we reminded it why it hated us. I was there at the end, not as a knight, not as a priest, not as anything worth remembering. That was the price of surviving. I gave up my name as one gives up a weapon when it has turned in the hand. I let it take the shape I wore in the world and left myself empty enough to pass unnoticed. Do not mistake that for bravery. It was cowardice refined into art. I remember pieces only. The mind protects itself by breaking what it cannot digest. Still, some fragments remain sharp enough to cut even now. I remember crowns made of thorns pressing into skulls until thought leaked out. I remember masks that grew warm and wet as they fused to screaming faces. I remember laughter that did not come from mouths, but from the space between things. I remember a woman who was never whole, whose beauty rearranged itself to suit the hunger of the moment. She was not a queen, though she wore crowns. She was not a goddess, though she demanded reverence. She was grief given teeth and patience. She spoke once, in a moment of stillness so heavy it bent the air, and in that moment I understood the worst of it. She was right. The forest had been butchered, cut, burned, hunted, nailed with symbols of changed faiths, until its oldest voices were reduced to whispers beneath root and soil. Men had come with axes and prayers, and called it righteousness, because they won. We never learn that winning is not the same as being forgiven. But hear this, reader. Hear it as warning, not absolution. Understanding her sorrow did not make her mercy any less absent. She mourned as a storm mourns a field. She remembered as fire remembers wood. Her lament was real, so was her cruelty. She taught us the lesson we teach the land, that power grants the right to reshape what resists. She simply learned it better. When the glamour broke, and it can be broken, though I pray no one tries again, it did not end the forest's hunger. It merely stripped away its ornamentation. The woods did not become safe. They became quiet. That is worse. Quiet is when the counting begins. I have seen men age into dust between one sunrise and the next. I have seen children forget how to speak because words were a luxury they could no longer afford. I have seen love twisted into a weapon sharp enough to carve memories out of the skull. And I have seen what happens when peasants are crowned king for a night. Remember that, especially if you live under banners and laws and think hierarchy a shield. Know that it is a joke, easily inverted. The forest laughed hardest when it made mockery of our order, when it put crowns on the bowed and forced the kneeling to kneel deeper. Power, it taught us, is funniest when it is temporary. If you are a knight reading this, burn your tabard and learn a trade. If you are a priest, pray elsewhere. If you are a scholar, take this as proof that not everything wants to be understood. And if you are none of these, if you are simply a traveler who heard music between the trees and wandered, run. Do not follow lights that drift without flame. Do not answer voices that know your name before you speak it. Do not trust beauty that demands reverence, nor sorrow that asks to be witnessed. Above all, do not laugh with the woods. Laughter is an invitation. I write this knowing it may already be too late. Ink cannot stop roots. Words do not hold against time. Even now, as I set down this final warning, I can hear the forest in the distance, not loud, not angry, merely present. It endures. It will outlast castles and prayers and this poor attempt at memory. One day, perhaps, the fields will be green again, and children will forget why they were told never to play near the trees. Someone will laugh, and someone else will answer. When that happens, remember this: the forest does not forgive. It does not forget, and it is never truly asleep. Written by a man who survived by becoming no one at all. The final page is blank, save for a single mark pressed deep into the vellum, as though the writer's hand had cramped in pain at the last moment. A thorn-shaped indentation. No ink, just the impression, waiting.